Hi, and thank you for joining us for week 3 of the inaugural One Campus, One Book program. We're back in the Hall of Fame room at Gaylord, and joining us today is Dean Gregg Garn, the Dean of the College of Education. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So we wanted to just begin with the question, just what did you think of the chapter?
Sure. So really a thought-provoking book. I think the main idea, like anything, is very provocative. So I think what the author was trying to do is not sort of find a middle ground, but really reach out and strike some pretty provocative comments and then see if he can evoke discussion. And that's kind of where maybe we ought to begin, because I think there's a couple things that sort of struck me. One is the idea that if you're looking for the problems or solutions in schools, I thought it was kind of interesting that he didn't actually talk with people who are in schools. So he does a lot of interviews with the education billionaires who I think even they would say are pretty well removed. But access to teachers and school leaders might be a good place to start to just get a sense of what do they see as the sort of issues, challenges, opportunity, those kinds of things. The one thing that I definitely would agree that came out is the lack of data on where the problems are at and how we solve those problems. I think that's just a system-wide issue that we're really scrambling with.
So last week we talked about the struggles facing the middle class. Are there connections between the previous chapter and this chapter on education?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's huge connections between the two. So Richard Rothstein is quoted in the book as saying, if you have a zip code, you can pretty well follow the quality of education. And so in some cases, you might have a really good teacher in a bad zip code, and their performance might not look very good. And conversely, you might have a terrible teacher, but in a very wealthy zip code, and it's going to look like those students are performing very well. So I think the consequence for schools is to think about this issue of equity. And if you've got this declining middle class, and increasingly for a state like Oklahoma, where more are moving into a lower class, one of the things that you really have to think about is how are their basic needs being met? And oftentimes for kids that are coming into schools, they simply aren't met. So they have food security issues. They have health kinds of medical issues that they're scrambling with. In fact, one of the solutions that I see as offering the most promise going forward is a concept called community schools, where you have the ability to have a teacher who's able to focus on the academics. They're not trying to be the social worker and the mental health professional and the immigration officer. They teach what they were prepared to do, and then those services are connected up in the school so the professionals can take care of those. So I think if you continue to see the collapse of the middle class, you can't expect that kids are going to be coming to school comfortable and ready to learn. You've got to take care of those basic needs, and then you can get to the academic.
So speaking about the academics, Luce talks a lot about Bill Gates kind of as a funder of the education system. But as a result of all the money Gates is putting in, he wants data points, which I think is something that's kind of in conflict with what a lot of teachers want. They want to just be able to teach, kind of like you were saying. Could you kind of elaborate on that idea that we really just need lots of data?
Yeah, so I think we have data. The problem is it doesn't ever get centralized, and oftentimes the data that we collect isn't used to influence performance. So what I mean by that is schools collect tons of data, but they shift it out to the State Department of Education for some report, or they shift it out to the federal government for some report. What they don't do is look at that data to see how does this teacher and his or her performance affect these students. And that's where I think we have a huge opportunity. I think Gates is actually right in the essence that we don't collect and organize that for performance. We basically do it as sort of a bureaucratic reporting technique rather than how can I improve the performance of my second grade students by looking at what are the learning standards that they're mastering and where is there some slippage so we can go back and improve there. So it's sort of a little bit more nuanced in terms of we have lots of data, but we're just maybe not using it in the right way. And that I think is a real opportunity for systems to improve.
And so what does kind of the focus of teachers need to be in the classroom to help produce the students that they want?
Yeah, I think one of the great conversations that we're having right now is learning standards. And so in the state of Oklahoma, as an example, historically we've had a set of standards called PASS, Priority Academic Skill Standards. For sort of the blink of an eye, we had the Common Core standards, and then they were repealed. And right now, we've either gone back to PASS or we've created something in the short term called the Oklahoma Academic Standards. I'm not exactly sure what those are or what they look like. The short term is we don't know what we're teaching to. And so if I'm a teacher in second grade or if I'm in a high school calculus class, learning standards are an important anchoring element to understand what do these kids need to be able to know and do by the time that they graduate. And right now we've got a pretty chaotic system. Again, one of my critiques of the book is that it's really good at identifying problems, not so good at providing solutions. And so in the effort to provide a solution at a state level, one of the things that I think we might do in this state is look to the ACT Aspire as a set of learning standards. And it's basically as simple as, if we want kids to be prepared for college, why wouldn't we use the learning standards that colleges and universities use as sort of that level of entry? So an ACT or an SAT score is a pretty important, not the only, but a pretty important component. Why wouldn't we align our K-12 learning and teaching to that as an assessment? And so just as an idea about, right now we're going to probably spend a year or more having conversations about standards. I think we could sidestep that by simply saying, if we want our kids to go to college, why wouldn't we prepare them for the test that determines that?
Yeah, so you kind of criticize Luce for not providing enough solutions. Are there any other solutions that you could see, and are any of those kind of being solved here at OU?
That's a great question. Yeah, one of them that I think we're on the sort of just in the early stages of solving is the idea of sort of character education. And I know that can be a little bit controversial, but if you think about what are the traits associated with having a good life, how do you flourish? Certainly, the university does an amazing job of preparing people in their academic content. So if you're going to be an engineer, if you're going to be a teacher, but I think beyond that technical preparation for this is the knowledge that you have, there's also this opportunity for sort of character and ideas like virtue and kindness and service. How do you give explicit instruction about those kinds of items? So if you look at, some people call them soft skills, but if you look at the most successful people, they're very good technically at what they do, but they also have another set of characteristics about them that lead them to success. And so it might be something like persistence. I run into an obstacle and I don't just quit and try something different. I persist through it and have that opportunity. I think the University of Oklahoma is actually a spot where you get that. So if you think about the big event, if you think about many of the service activities that you do while you're on campus, from Camp Crimson from the very beginning on through to graduation, you get some of those experiences, and I think this university is leading in that conversation, whereas many others are just sort of thinking about it. We're actually doing it, and I think in the next year or so, we're getting ready to do that in a much more systematic way.
Do you have any final comments about this chapter before we finish?
Now, I think just in general, certainly an interesting read. I think the sort of takeaway is, if this can start a discussion that gets lots of stakeholders together about how do we improve the educational system, whether it's the investment that pay off nicely in early childhood education to a graduate seminar and everything in between, there's always opportunities to get better. And I think the spirit of this university is to engage in conversations about doing just that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And like you said, we really want everybody to kind of join this conversation. This chapter covers an issue that all of us can relate to, I'm sure. So make sure you're commenting on this video or on the blog or on our hashtag #OU1book. I hope to see you next week. And once again, thank you for joining us.